You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Greeks Gridiron. I'm Ethan Haristadoulou, and today, some big news to discuss dropping from the UFL communications team yesterday on the socials. We have an official rulebook for the 2024 season. I'll have a link down in the description if you are interested in taking a look at the entire thing. They dropped a whole rulebook and then highlighted some of the big changes, or just things that you can expect to see coming into this 2024 UFL season. I'll be diving into those today with you all, so I invite you to comment down below. Let me hear your thoughts and opinions on some of these big rule changes, or not necessarily changes, I guess, but the establishment of the league's new rules, which is kind of a combination of some things from the USFL and some things from the XFL, which kind of expected, not really surprised. Get a little bit from both leagues as they sort out what they want to do for season number 1. Now, we'll start off with the first thing, kickoff rules. There's a handful of them here. I got 3 different things bullet pointed out in my notes to discuss with you all. First thing we'll start with is the actual kickoff ruling itself. Kickoffs are going to look like traditional college NFL kickoffs, pretty much as is from what you see, except they will take place from the 20-yard line. This will essentially make it so that kickoffs are more viable and you're more likely to see returns from them. This will ultimately wind up probably setting offenses up to have some shorter field positions, but it leads to kickoffs actually mattering within the actual game, which is something that the NFL seems to be kind of shying away from over the years, and not something as a football purist I'm not necessarily a fan of. I enjoy kickoffs. I love good kickoff returners. We just saw Devin Hester get inducted into the NFL, or I guess Pro Football Hall of Fame, not NFL Hall of Fame, Pro Football Hall of Fame. So I do like the idea of not taking away kickoffs from the game and actually trying to invite them. On top of that, a kickoff out of bounds gives possession to the receiving team 30 yards from the spot of the kickoff or at the spot where the ball went out of bounds. On top of that, a kickoff is untouched by the receiving team, may only be recovered by the kicking team up to 20 yards from the spot of the kickoff. So you can't necessarily go for like a fake, like an onside kick or something like that, or a fake, kick it, let's say 25 yards deep and try to make a recovery there. It has to be within that 20-yard gray spot from where the ball is actually kicked. So essentially from the 20 to the 40-yard line of the kicking side of the football. Some other kicking and touchback rules that we have here: all touchbacks on kicks, which is a punt or a kickoff, will be placed at the receiving team's 25-yard line. So a little bit of an adoption from what the NFL was doing this year, something that you kind of been seeing in from college for the last handful of years now. Any punt that goes out of bounds or inside the receiving team's 25-yard line will be considered a touchback and placed at the 25-yard line. So that's a punt specifically, not a kickoff. Remember, kickoff out of bounds rules, they have their own thing. We just talked about that a second ago. Non-kicking touchbacks will also be placed at the 25-yard line. So that kind of jumps us into the next piece of kickoff rulings, and that's kind of how alternate possession options have been introduced. So we've seen the NFL kind of experiment with this in the preseason, and this is something that spring leagues have kind of been known for now. Onside kicks obviously allowed at any time during the game, but teams do get an alternate option to retain possession in the fourth quarter. If a team is tied or behind during the fourth quarter, they may elect to retain possession after a score with a 4th and 12 from its own 28-yard line, opting to kind of sway things a little bit differently. Some teams hesitant to do the onside kick. Onside kicks necessarily don't have the most, I would say, successful win rate in pretty much professional football. I don't even want to just say the NFL, but just in football in general, onside kicks are not something you really see that happen often and happen successfully at that. So giving an option like 4th and 12 where teams might feel like, they have a good play that they can run that can net them 12 yards and maybe shift the game in their favor. I like the idea of that. That's something that, again, we've been kind of seeing be approached now for a while by the NFL even themselves. And it's one of those things that with the way offensive football has kind of shifted in later years, it makes sense. It feels like a natural progression. It's an option, but not one that you can take whenever you want. It's in high critical situations with certain parameters listed around it, like being down and or tied within the fourth quarter. So I am a fan of that. Moving away from kickoffs, though, but still on the topic of kicking, because I think if I'm reading this correctly, this is how it's going to be. PATs. Teams will have 3 scrimmage play run pass options following a touchdown. This kind of sounds like this means there's no point after attempts, like an actual kick. I don't know if that's just something that they failed to mention in the description of the article there. Maybe I missed it. I haven't had time to dive into the whole rule book. Busy person, so that'll be something that maybe I have to go back and look at later. But the wording of it makes it sound like there's no actual kick after the touchdown, and it's all just you run a play, which being a run or a pass option, from the 2-yard line, giving you a 1-point try, from the 5-yard line, giving you a 2-point try, and from the 10-yard line, a 3-point try. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this comes from the XFL's style of PATs. I honestly, and I've said this a lot, for those of you unaware, did not follow the XFL like that. I don't know if they had PATs or not, so I don't know if this was strictly what they were doing or if this is just something that's brought over, but I know that this is XFL stuff, so I don't know if the whole just no point after attempts via kick is a thing from the XFL, or if that's just an adjustment that they're making going just with the offensive play following a touchdown. Whatever the decision is, does not matter to me. I will say I'm not and this is me just being a traditionalist and someone who loves the game of football and does not want to see things taken away. I don't like the idea that there might not be an option to just kick for an extra point. I would like to see that being an option there. But again, that's a big if, because I don't necessarily know. I am a little confused because there's no mention of it not being a part of it, but it's also not mentioned within this list of extra point try options. So that's something I'm definitely going to have to look for some clarity on. As for everything else, though, beyond all the kicking stuff and special teams that we've been discussing, we can talk some offensive and defensive rules here that stuck out from the press release. And we'll start with the offensive rules. First being the 2 forward passes rule. Teams will be allowed, as they were in both leagues last season, to throw 2 forward passes on a play, but the ball cannot cross the line of scrimmage at any time prior to the second forward pass being thrown. So you can't throw the ball 5 yards down the field and then have that wide receiver or tight end, whoever it is that catches the football, running back, whatever you want to call them, and then have them throw the football even further forward. If you're going to do a double forward pass, it has to be done behind the line of scrimmage. This is one of those things where it's very like backyard football-esque. I'm fine with it, but traditionalist in me doesn't want to see it, but I am also intrigued by the idea of it. And it's something that we didn't necessarily see a ton of in the USFL, and something that I would like to see expanded on a little bit more by offenses, just so I can really determine how I feel about it. In the few instances I saw it, I thought, wow, this is crazy. How do you stop this, though, if it becomes like a commonplace thing? And it's also one of those things where it's like, if it becomes commonplace, do we just start like shifting away from traditional football, and now we're just seeing this wacky backyard style that, further separates spring football from professional football, whereas the idea here is that this spring league is supposed to help get guys into the professional league, and we don't want that to hurt some of these players because maybe, your production is based solely off of you being able to run all these wacky trick plays, which is kind of something you see with the CFL and NFL, where the rules are so vastly different. Even players that exceed at a high level in the CFL don't necessarily get quite the same looks as guys coming from leagues that are within the US or maybe even Europe overseas, where they have more traditional style of football similar to NFL rule sets, field sizes, and all that kind of stuff. It's just one of those things that I need to see more of before I can really come up with like an actual opinion on. So I'm kind of like neutral on it right now. I'm intrigued, I will say that. I just don't necessarily know how I feel by it, because I need to see more of it to really come up to like a decision on that one. The second thing is the catch definition that they brought up here, which I like. I feel like this is something that needs very clear descriptions on when it comes to football as a whole. The conversation of what is a catch has been something that has captured the NFL world for quite some time, and it seems more and more now that everyone has a good understanding, now that the NFL has gone like all in on really clarifying the rules. So I'm glad the UFL is doing the same. They say that a catch is a completed catch or interception defined as a player securing control of the ball prior to the ball touching the ground, and touching the ground inbounds with both feet or with any part of his body other than his hands. And for those that you maybe have missed this, 2 feet in bounds is going to be a part of that as well. So if you're making sideline catches, both feet must be in bounds. I'm very glad that they went and did that. As somebody who is a pro football fan over collegiate football fan, I do like 2 feet in bounds over 1 feet in bounds. So that is something that I enjoy. But I'm glad that they have a clear catch definition. I feel like that's fairly understandable. There's always the situation of things that can come up that always challenge the catch rule, and what are we actually seeing versus what the rule book is saying, and yada, yada, yada. I'm sure in some way somehow there's going to be a catch that puts this whole thing into question. But again, the transparency on what a catch is, I think, is key. Beyond that, defensive side, pass interference. And this one I kind of have an interesting opinion on here because there's some like subjective stuff in wording to this that makes me kind of curious how this could play out in some scenarios. But defensive pass interference will result in a 15-yard penalty or a spot foul if the foul occurred less than 15 yards down the field. Now, intentional defensive pass interference will result in a spot foul if it is beyond 15 yards downfield. And it's that intentional wording there that kind of makes me a little bit nervous. Now, one way to kind of avoid this whole issue altogether is that if they're looking for intentional pass interference, they are looking for blatantly obvious, he's clearly trying to interfere with the pass because he knows he's got beat type of stuff for whoever it is that's in coverage. However, my concern is that we come into a situation where there's pass interference that maybe it looks intentional, but the receiver's like, no, it's not, or excuse me, the defensive back, the linebacker, whoever it is in coverage is like, no, that wasn't intentional, blah, blah, blah. And then I don't like having subjective nature involved in rules because it's up to the officials to decide. And then at that point, it becomes a whole thing. It's one of those things that we just kind of have to wait and see, but I just don't like the idea of having officials be put in a position where they have to decide if something was intentional or not. Like, I feel like that's a very slippery slope. And, you know, like, what is intent? What is not intent? How can you prove that that is intent without the defensive back or whoever admitting that it's intentful? You know, it's a slippery slope. So it's one of those things that I'm very much on the fence on. I get like the whole point behind it because you don't want people just, you know, committing PI for the sake of committing PI because they got beat 35 yards down the field and they know it's only a 15-yard penalty. Like, I get that. I understand why the NFL does spot foul as opposed to 15 yards because as professionals at the very highest of levels, egos can, you know, be put in check and whatnot, and someone might, you know, do something for the sake of stopping a play from happening, and you don't want a limitation on the yardage of being, you know, for that penalty being put into question. So I understand why the NFL does just strictly spot. This in-between thing, another one of those, I'm just going to have to kind of wait and see. Now, with that being said, the next thing we'll jump into is this is basically like just other miscellaneous rules that they had listed towards the end of the press release. And this kind of, I guess, segues into my fears of that. Because they are going to allow replay reviews of certain things. They're also going to have coaches challenges, and we'll talk the coaches challenges in a second because I do think that is something that could help mitigate that issue that I just spoke of. But replay reviews, designated members of the officiating department may stop a game at any time before the ball is next legally put in play to review a play if the play is reviewable and there is reasonable evidence to believe an error was made in the initial ruling and it would have a direct competitive impact on the game. So while I have concerns about the whole PI situation, they're going to allow a replay team to step in and be like, hey, you know what, on second thought, probably not the right call. And the idea is that this is going to be done by a team made from a secure location separate from the site of the game. So this is like an off-site neutral. We're a bunch of guys, you know, officiating guys sitting in a room, watching screens, getting all the angles to try to make a determination on if this was the right call or not. So I'm okay with this. I really like this. This is something that, at least as somebody who watched the USFL, really enjoyed seeing during the couple of seasons that they had prior to this UFL merger. And I'm all for it. So that kind of mitigates my concern to an extent, but I still just don't like the idea of putting something like intent into a official ruling on a type of penalty because, again, it's subjective. How can you prove the intent if the player's not admitting the intent and it's not necessarily the most obvious thing? I guess having something like this does help mitigate the issue. A couple other things on the replay reviews, though. Any call or non-call related to player safety is going to be subject to review at any point during the game, and this also includes officiating ruling in the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter or overtime that is obviously an incorrect call and will have a significant impact on the outcome of the game. And by obviously an incorrect call, they mean to people that are not on the football field, as in the officials themselves. I think one thing that gets lost on a lot of people these days is that It's very different when you are watching a game on television from every single possible angle that they can show you, with how good the camera systems have gotten these days in television broadcasting for sports specifically, whereas the officials are just a handful of guys with one set of eyes that are in one specific direction that only get to, in theory, see, I think the UFL has 7 officials on field, 7 eyes in certain directions at certain times. So it's good to have this fail-safe here with the guys in the room somewhere that maybe get to see angles that the officials on the field just didn't happen to see, because again, they are only humans, and it gets lost on people that you only have 7 sets of eyes that can look in one specific direction at any given moment, and they all have different assignments. Things can be missed. Unless there's more officials on the field with more sets of eyes, they can't get more views as human beings themselves. So it's good that we have something like this as a fail-safe. If for whatever reason somehow something got missed, there are people being fed all those camera angles I just talked about that can ultimately swap a decision or maybe change something if it is deemed necessary. And I like that. I think that's something the NFL really needs to strangle themselves into, because it's you know, we hear how loud the cries are in the NFL about officiating, and I'll just leave it at that. As for coaches' challenges, this is also something that I think is interesting. Each coach may challenge any ruling, including fouls or potential fouls, one time during the course of a contest, provided the team has a timeout remaining to lose, should they lose the actual challenge. Interesting that it's only one. The next line says, a successful challenge will not result in a loss of a timeout, while the timeout is lost if the challenge is unsuccessful. So the wording makes it sound like you only get one challenge, but you can literally challenge anything. Like, there's not a confine within what you can and cannot challenge. Like, basically, you can literally challenge anything you want as long as you have a timeout, but specifically one time during the contest. Interesting. I'll be curious to see if that gets expanded on down the road to maybe 2 challenges. I like the idea of 2 challenges, and I also like the idea of having 2 challenges, and if you get them both right, you win yourself a third one. But at the same time, I'll be interested to see how this works with coaches knowing they only have one challenge in the pocket, but also knowing they can literally look at anything, and if they really disagree, they can throw the red flag on it. So, interesting little piece of information there, and something worth watching. As for overtime will consist of alternating attempts to score from the opponent's 5-yard line with no kicks allowed. It will be a best-of-3 format, or until a winner has been determined. I'm fine with this. I will say that after, the Super Bowl having just passed, really liked the overtime rules for the NFL Super Bowl matchup there. I thought that was a lot of fun. It was really exciting. I know that some people were a little confused on it. Granted, that's the first time anyone in the audience was watching. It's a damn shame that players and or coaches were concerned about or confused about it, because that is your job to know those things. And it's not like the rules are new. They were put in place a couple of years ago. So I will say I enjoyed the overtime style of the NFL this year in the playoffs. Not a big fan of overtime during the regular season. It's one of those things that I hate ties in the NFL, and it's one of those things that I wish would just go away. I like that the UFL has a structure where you cannot end in a tie, and it's something that's quick. It's not super demanding. I really like that. So these overtime rules, I'm here for. As exciting as it was to watch a whole 5th quarter of overtime action in the Super Bowl, I will say that I do like this style because it puts the stakes that much higher, and it makes it that much more exciting, whereas you're just getting more action. But either or, I mean, I guess it's like, what is your cup of tea, basically? And I kind of enjoy both flavors. So I'm not really sitting here complaining or, bashing on one thing or the other. I'm a fan of both ideas. So I'm here for it. I like it. I like for spring football with the emphasis, at least that the USFL had last year, to keep games quick. I'll be curious to see if that's something they try to do as in the UFL as well. I feel like faster spring football games feel good. I like the rapid pace of them. It keeps the action flowing. It keeps the action going. And it didn't necessarily affect score lines or anything like that. Like, we saw a handful of games push well over 40 plus points by both teams combined. So it's definitely not something I would be opposed to seeing, but that is definitely something I'm really hoping that the UFL tries to do with the merged situation now, is try to keep games moving quick, keep, get in, get out, be done, because on top of that, you have to remember spring leagues are designed to give guys opportunities to go into the professionals, and they're playing far longer stretch of a schedule if they do jump from spring football to the NFL. You don't want them to be risking more injury than necessary. So keeping game action quick allows the guys to get the game action, get the reps, keep themselves in football shape during the offseason of the NFL, and you get to minimize at least the amount of time and potential risk for injury. So I would not mind seeing something like that structured in as well. But that could also be something in the rule book that I just, again, have not had the time to dive into. But those are all the big rules that were highlighted in the press release. Again, UFL communication. I'm going to keep stumbling on that. UFL communications on X is where this initial post dropped, at least for me to see. You can always go to the UFL website. You can go there. They have all their big updates posted on there on the site itself. I have a link to the actual rule book in the description down below if you're interested in looking at it. But that is it for me, my UFL people. I appreciate you all. If you made it to the end, as always, greatly appreciate that as well. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.